Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into something a little different today?
Definitely. We're going to explore leadership, but we're taking our cues from, well, the football pitch.
You got it. Specifically, Brazilian football. We're dissecting a super interesting interview with Diego Ribas.
He was on the Denílson show, Com Chico Garcia podcast. And honestly, he dropped some serious wisdom about leadership.
Right. And the best part is, you don't have to be a football expert to get a lot out of this.
Not at all. The principles he talks about, they apply to any team, any project, really any area of life where you're trying to lead or even just up your game.
One thing that jumped out at me was his emphasis on direct feedback. Like, really straight-talking, honest communication.
Yeah. He contrasted his experience playing in Brazil versus Germany. In Germany, even the star players got called out if they weren't meeting standards.
It was a total culture shock for him. He told this story about, just casually tossing his jersey on the locker room floor after a match.
Something he probably did without thinking back in Brazil.
Totally. But in Germany, the locker room attendant was like, nope, pick that up. You're responsible for your own laundry.
He was like, what? Because he's used to being the star player, getting a bit of special treatment.
I can imagine. So did it end there?
Oh, no. The club director called him in for a chat, basically said, look, Diego, it doesn't matter how many goals you score, rules are rules, everyone's got to follow them.
Wow. Talk about a lesson in humility and accountability.
Exactly. Diego realized that this wasn't personal, it was about the culture of the team. Respect was a core value.
And he brought that mindset back with him to Brazil, even when leading teams with, let's just say, a lot of big personalities.
Right. He had to figure out how to make that kind of direct feedback work, even with guys who were used to being the man.
Like leading Flamengo with Diego Alves, Rafinha, Felipe Luis, and, of course, Gabigol. Not exactly shrinking violets, right?
Not at all. But Diego's approach was, real talk builds trust. Players, especially those with strong egos, actually crave that honesty.
It makes sense. They want to know where they stand.
He said it breeds accountability, too. Everyone's clear on what's expected, and they know there are consequences if they don't step up.
It reminded me of the story he told about Denílson clashing with coach Ricardo Gomes back when they were playing in Bordeaux.
Oh, yeah. Denílson was benched and was taking it out on everyone during training.
Frustrated, right.
Totally. But instead of just laying down the law, Ricardo Gomes sat Denílson down and calmly explained his reasoning. He even showed him stats about injury prevention to back up his decision.
So it was data-driven coaching, but also about respecting the player enough to explain the why.
Exactly. Denílson said he felt relieved, actually. Like, the air was cleared, he understood the decision, even if he didn't love it.
Both those stories, with Diego and Denílson, they highlight the power of clear, direct communication.
Absolutely. Whether you're giving feedback, explaining a decision, or just laying out expectations, that kind of honesty builds trust and makes a team stronger.
And I think it ties in with another point Diego made, the importance of shared leadership. Especially with that 2019 Flamengo squad, he called them a team of captains.
Yeah. You had Diego Alves, Rafinha, Felipe Luis, Rodrigo Caio, Gerson Aram, Bruno Henry. Talk about a lineup of strong personalities.
He couldn't be the boss in that environment.
No way. He had to be more collaborative, recognizing that leadership can come from different places.
It takes humility to step back and let others lead in their own way. But I'm curious about how that played out when there was conflict. He talked about how he dealt with the whole Gabigol saga, for example.
Yeah, it seems like he always tried to address conflicts head-on, but his priority was always maintaining team unity.
So tackling the problem, but framing it within that bigger picture of the team's goals.
Right. He said he'd bring the team leaders together to have those tough conversations with Gabigol, set clear expectations, but also make sure everyone was still focused on winning.
I wonder if that experience shaped his views on how clubs should handle, farewells for star players.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, he compared how Gabigol left Flamengo to Dudu's departure from Palmeiras.
Flamengo, even though there were some disagreements, they gave Gabigol this huge send-off, acknowledging everything he'd done for the club.
Total appreciation for his legacy. But Dudu's farewell from Palmeiras, it was much quieter, almost like they hadn't fully embraced what he'd meant to the club.
Diego seemed to be advocating for this culture of respect and gratitude. Like, Even if you disagree, you recognize the contribution.
Especially for those iconic players who have shaped the club's history.
It's a powerful message, and it makes me think about the whole conversation we're having now about mental health in football.
Oh, yeah. It's like recognizing the human side of the game.
Exactly. We put these athletes on a pedestal, but they're dealing with so much pressure.
And it's great to see that vulnerability being met with support, not stigma.
Like with Casio, right? Him opening up about his struggles is a huge step, and Diego really praised him for that.
He did. And he talked about how important it is for leaders to create an environment with players feel comfortable seeking help.
It's about shifting the culture, recognizing that mental well-being is just as important as physical fitness.
Totally. And it's something that we need to keep talking about, not just in football, but in every area of life.
This actually leads into another insightful point Diego made, the importance of broadening your horizons. He talked about how interacting with people outside of football helped prepare him for life after his playing career.
He said it gave him a different perspective on things, helped him develop new skills, and you can see that in everything he's doing now, from his podcast to his speaking engagements.
He didn't just retire and disappear. He's constantly learning, growing, evolving.
It's like he's saying, don't let yourself get stuck in a bubble, even if you're at the top of your game.
Which, speaking of the game, brings us back to his thoughts on the evolving role of the number 10. Remember how he talked about Brazilian football moving away from that traditional playmaker?
Yeah, he mentioned João Paulo Sampaio, who's the youth coordinator for Palmeiras. He said Brazilian football is kind of killing the number 10.
He sees it as this emphasis on immediate results, prioritizing strength and speed over creativity.
Which makes me wonder if that's part of what Diego Simeone was getting at when he challenged Diego to change his style at Atletico de Madrid.
You know, pushing him to play more centrally, to exploit those spaces, rather than relying solely on those classic number 10 skills.
It sounds like a clash between individual flair and tactical discipline.
Right, like finding that balance between expressing your talent and fitting into a system. But before we delve into that, I think it's worth taking a quick look at the bigger picture of Brazilian football, with the rise of the SAF model.
Agreed. It'll give our listeners some context for what Diego's talking about. So for those who don't know, SF stands for Sociedade Anônima do Futebol, which basically means Football Corporation.
It's a new ownership model, and it's changing things up rapidly.
And Diego had some thoughts on how this might impact leadership and decision-making within clubs.
We definitely need to unpack that.
And while we're at it, we should also touch on his thoughts about Ronaldo potentially becoming the head of the CBF.
The Brazilian Football Confederation, that's a big one.
Definitely. To have a former player with Ronaldo's stature in that position, it could be a game changer.
I'm excited to dive into all of this.
Me too. This is where it gets really interesting. We're starting to see how all these themes, leadership, adaptation, communication, the future of the game itself, they're all connected.
And it all stems from this one conversation with Diego Ribas, who knew that a deep dive into a football interview could be so revealing about leadership in any field.
Right. It just shows you that the principles of great leadership, they're universal. Whether you're on the pitch or in the boardroom, they apply. It's amazing how much this conversation keeps coming back to that human element of leadership, you know? Like, remember how Diego talked about treating departing players with respect, even if there were disagreements? That same principle applies to how we deal with mental health in football.
Yeah, like he's saying, strong leadership isn't just about, tactics and strategies. It's about recognizing that these are human beings, not just players. And he was really impressed with Casio, for being so open about his emotional struggles.
Totally. That took guts. And it's encouraging to see that he's getting support, not judgment. Diego seems to believe that kind of openness is key to changing the culture, so players feel comfortable asking for help.
Which is huge, right? Because the conversation around mental health in football, it's definitely evolving, even in a traditionally macho environment like that.
Oh, yeah. And we can't ignore the role of social media in all of this. Diego talked about how much added pressure players face today, all that scrutiny, the potential for negativity, especially for those on the national team.
He pointed out how even a harmless post can be twisted, especially after a tough loss.
It's a good reminder that these guys are under a microscope. What they do on and off the field, it impacts public perception.
Big time. Which ties back to his point about clear communication, right?
Exactly. He stressed that players need to be really careful about their online presence, especially when they're representing Brazil. Think about the message they're sending.
It's about being strategic, I guess. You can use social media to connect with fans, build that passion, but you also got to be aware of the risks.
For sure. It's a tightrope walk. And speaking of balance, Diego also talked about players needing a wider perspective on their careers, not just focusing on the next game, but also preparing for the future. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like not getting stuck in that football bubble. He stressed the importance of developing skills beyond the sport, making connections outside of that world.
And he's living proof of that. He's a speaker, a podcaster, an entrepreneur. He's always pushing himself to learn and grow.
It really underscores the importance of expanding your horizons. It can open up so many possibilities.
Right. Never stop learning, right? Which brings us back to the changing role of the number 10, which is being shaped by all these shifts happening within the game itself.
Like we were saying earlier, it seems like Brazilian football is moving away from that traditional playmaker role.
Yeah, and remember what João Paulo Sampaio said. He's the youth coordinator for Palmeiras. He basically said that Brazilian football is killing the number 10.
He thinks it's because of this obsession with immediate results. Everyone wants to win now, so they focus on strength and speed rather than nurturing creativity and playmaking.
Which makes you think about what Diego Simeone was doing with Diego at Atletico de Madrid, right?
Yeah.
Pushing him to play differently.
Simeone wanted him to operate more centrally, to exploit spaces between the lines, rather than relying on those classic number 10 skills.
Sounds like Simeone was challenging him to adapt, to find new ways to impact the game.
Right. It was almost like a clash between individual flair and tactical discipline. Remember that story Diego told about getting subbed out at halftime? He went straight to Simeone to question it.
And Simeone basically said, if you're playing for yourself and not the team, you're out. No messing around.
Wow. Talk about direct feedback. It was a wake-up call for Diego. He realized that sometimes you have to sacrifice personal preferences for the good of the team.
Which is a powerful lesson for any leader, really. It's not about you. It's about the collective goal.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of having a coach who can communicate their vision clearly, even if it means challenging the star player.
Totally. Which brings us to another big shift happening in Brazilian football, the rise of the SAF model. We touched on it earlier, but I think it's worth diving in a bit deeper.
Definitely. So for our listener who might not be familiar, SAF stands for Sociedade Anônima do Futebol, which basically means turning clubs into corporations.
It's a big deal, and Diego believes it has the potential to make club management more professional. But he also warned against prioritizing profits over the fans' passion, and the history of the clubs.
He mentioned Botafogo as an example of a club that's doing well under the SAF model.
He did. But he also stressed that professionalism shouldn't just rely on SAF. It needs competent, committed leaders no matter who owns the club.
He also praised Flamengo for being transparent about their financial struggles, even if it meant making tough choices in the short term.
It's about honesty and openness, which builds trust with the fans, and ultimately that makes for a stronger club.
Exactly. And speaking of leadership at a national level, Diego weighed in on Ronaldo Fenomeno potentially running for president of the CBF, the Brazilian Football Confederation.
He seemed pretty optimistic about it. He thinks Ronaldo has the experience, the vision, and the charisma to lead Brazilian football into the future.
It's an interesting idea. Diego even compared it to what's happening in Argentina, with former players like Scaloni, Samuel, and Aymar on the coaching staff.
It makes sense. Who better to understand what players need than those who have been there, done that?
Right. Having that firsthand experience could be incredibly valuable. And Diego emphasized the importance of veteran players on the national team, acting as mentors to the younger generation. Passing on that love for the jersey, the pride of representing Brazil.
He feels strongly about that. He even said some players who go abroad can lose touch with the Brazilian fans. It's about rekindling that connection, that passion.
Playing with heart, leaving it all on the pitch. But of course, he also brought up the potential downsides of social media, especially for those national team players.
He's all about that balance. He cautioned against careless posts that could be misinterpreted, especially after a loss. Players need to be mindful of their image, especially when they're representing their country.
He also stressed the importance of good communication with the media, being professional, transparent, building positive relationships.
It all comes back to respect, right? Respect for the game, respect for the fans, respect for each other.
It sounds like Diego is advocating for a more well-rounded approach to leadership. It's not just about winning at all costs. It's about the human element, communication, the long-term health of the sport.
Which is pretty refreshing, right? Especially in a world that's often obsessed with winning no matter what the cost.
It is. It makes you wonder if this more thoughtful approach might be gaining traction as the game evolves.
Maybe we're seeing a shift toward a more balanced and sustainable vision of success. One that prioritizes the well-being of the players and the sport itself alongside those victories.
That's a really interesting question to consider. But before we get too philosophical, let's bring it back to Diego's personal journey. I'm curious to hear more about that pivotal moment with Simeone at Atletico de Madrid.
Me too. It sounds like a real turning point in his career, and I bet the lessons he learned there will resonate with anyone who's had to adapt their approach to overcome challenges.
All right, let's rewind back to Diego's time at Atletico de Madrid. He talked about how Simeone, famous for his intense coping style, really pushed him to rethink his role on the field.
It was a huge challenge for him. As a classic number 10, he was used to being the playmaker, the guy who orchestrates the attack. But Simeone had a different vision.
More disciplined.
Definitely. He wanted Diego to play more centrally, focus on exploiting those gaps between the opponent's lines.
So less about individual brilliance, more about tactical awareness.
Exactly. And for a player like Diego, who was known for his creativity, it must have felt pretty restrictive at first.
Did he resist?
He admitted that he did initially, but then he started to see how Simeone's approach was actually bringing out a different side of his game.
So instead of viewing it as a limitation, he embraced it as a chance to grow.
Exactly. And that's a powerful mindset shift, right? To see challenges as opportunities. And remember that story about him getting subbed out at halftime?
Oh yeah, he marched right up to Simeone to ask why.
And Simeone, blunt as ever, told him, as long as you're playing for yourself and not the team, you're out. Talk about tough love.
Wow. It was a real wake-up call for Diego. He realized that even the most talented players need to put the team first.
It's not about individual glory, it's about the collective goal. And sometimes that means adapting your style, even sacrificing personal preferences.
Which, reminds me of something Denílson said about the importance of simplifying things. He realized that to really connect with people, especially those who aren't football experts, you got to be able to explain complex tactics in a way that makes sense.
That's so true. And it applies to leadership, too. If you can't communicate your vision in a clear, concise way, you're going to lose people.
It's about meeting people where they are, not expecting them to decipher your jargon or complex strategies.
Right. And I think Diego is really good at that. He breaks down these complex leadership principles by telling stories, using examples that everyone can relate to.
It's engaging, it's memorable, it makes you want to listen.
Exactly. And it makes you realize that all these things we've been talking about, leadership, communication, adaptation, the changing landscape of football, it's all interconnected.
It's like a web, right?
Yeah.
And it all ties back to this idea of evolving, of not being afraid to challenge yourself and step outside your comfort zone.
And, it's relevant to everyone, not just footballers. No matter what field you're in, what challenges you're facing, these principles apply.
This has been such an insightful conversation. We've covered so much ground, from locker room anecdotes to the future of Brazilian football, and I feel like we've uncovered some truly valuable leadership lessons along the way.
I agree. And it all came from this one casual conversation with Diego Ribas, who knew that a deep dive into a football interview could be so revealing about leadership in any field.
Right. It's amazing what you can learn when you really listen. So before we sign off, let's leave our listeners with one final question to ponder. What leadership lesson from Diego's experiences resonated with you most, and how can you apply it in your own life?
That's a great question. Whether it's embracing feedback, adapting to new challenges, or just communicating more clearly, there's something in here for everyone to take away.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into leadership Brazilian football style. We'll catch you next time.